The small country town of Ashwood had always been quiet, tucked away beneath the stretch of sprawling woods that seemed to grow darker with every season. The townspeople were simple folk, content in their routines, where the oddities of the world stayed outside their borders. That is, until the disappearance of Samuel "Sammy" Greer, a homeless man who had made the outskirts of Ashwood his home for as long as anyone could remember. Sammy wasn't much of a stranger. Most people had learned to ignore him over the years. His tattered clothes and grizzled beard had become part of the town's background. Sammy was a man of few words, mumbling to himself as he roamed from street to street, occasionally asking for a meal or a few coins, but no one really paid him much mind. That was until the day he vanished. It began like any other Thursday. The morning fog rolled in, blanketing Ashwood with an eerie calm. By noon, the first whispers began. Sammy hadn't been seen for 2 days. In a town where everyone knew everyone, this wasn't normal. At first, the people assumed he'd just wandered off, as he often did, into the woods or down the railway tracks. But as the days passed, something unsettling began to settle in. The strange phenomena started slowly, almost imperceptibly. Mrs. Larkin, the local baker, was the first to notice something was wrong. She swore she saw Sammy standing at the edge of the forest late one evening, his figure barely visible in the dimming light. When she called out to him, there was no response, and when she turned back to check, he was gone. The next day, there was an unmistakable chill in the air, a coldness that seemed to seep into the bones of every person in town. That evening, in the dead of night, the sound of tapping on windows began. Soft at first, like the click of fingers on glass, then growing louder, more persistent. Several residents heard it, all at different times. The town's sheriff, a thick-set man named Harold Jenkins, brushed it off as an animal, perhaps a raccoon or some kind of bird. But as more and more people came forward, there was no ignoring it. Then came the strange, bone-chilling howls. It wasn't an animal, not by any means. It sounded almost human, the kind of scream you hear in nightmares. High-pitched, desperate, and filled with agony. Some swore it was coming from the woods. Others insisted it was from the old train yard near the edge of town where Sammy used to wander. But no one dared to go out and investigate. They were too afraid of what they might find. As the weeks went by, more unsettling events followed. People began seeing Sammy's face in their windows, pale and gaunt, his eyes wide open but lifeless. He would appear only for a moment before vanishing, as if the world had blinked him out of existence. His figure started to appear in reflections. Mirrors, puddles, even the polished glass of car windows. No one knew whether they were hallucinating or if something far more sinister was at play. The nightmares became worse. People dreamt of walking through the woods, a thick fog around them, and a constant whispering sound, like leaves rustling underfoot, but much too deliberate. In the dreams, they would always find themselves standing at the edge of a clearing, looking at a shallow grave. As they approached it, they would see Sammy lying there, his body mangled, eyes wide open in terror, and his mouth open in a silent scream. Then they would hear the whispering again, this time louder, more urgent, calling their name. It was impossible to escape. By the time the sheriff called a town meeting, the atmosphere in Ashwood had become suffocating. People were terrified, whispering that Sammy's spirit hadn't left. Something had happened to him in the woods, something far darker than anyone could explain. The meeting was held at the town hall, a small, creaky building near the center of town. The townspeople sat in rows, their faces pale, their hands trembling. Sheriff Jenkins paced back and forth at the front of the room, looking every bit as nervous as everyone else. "We're all scared, I understand," Jenkins said, his voice strained. "But we have to face the facts. Sammy's disappearance isn't just strange, it's unnatural." He paused as if trying to collect his thoughts, his gaze flicking nervously toward the door. "I've had men searching the woods for weeks now, and there's been no sign of him. No tracks, no clues, nothing." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Larkin was the first to speak up, her voice quivering. "Sheriff, it's not just that. There's something wrong in the woods. People are hearing things, seeing things." Her hands were clenched together, her knuckles white. "It's Sammy? I know it's him. I saw him in the window, but when I turned to look, he was gone." Sheriff Jenkins sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what's going on, but I'll tell you this. We're not dealing with just a missing person. Something's happened here. Something unnatural." At that moment, the door to the town hall slammed open. The wind howled, and a shadowy figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. Everyone gasped. It was Sammy, his clothes in tatters, his skin pale and stretched tight over his bones. His eyes were hollow like empty sockets, and his lips parted into a grotesque grin. His face was twisted with pain, his expression frozen in eternal terror. "Sammy!" someone cried out, but when the figure moved forward, it wasn't Sammy at all. It was something else, something more terrifying. The figure's movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. It reached out with gnarled fingers, and the crowd screamed in unison. Suddenly the lights flickered and went out. For several moments, the hall was plunged into darkness. Then a terrible screeching sound echoed through the room, followed by a soft, whispering voice. It was the voice of Sammy, but it wasn't right. It was distorted, cracked, like a voice from beyond the grave. Help me, it's too late." The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, and when the lights came back on, Sammy was gone. A week passed with no further sightings of Sammy, or whatever had been haunting them. The town slowly returned to a semblance of normality, but the fear lingered in the air, thick and suffocating. And then one night, Sheriff Jenkins went missing. No one knows what happened to him. All that was found were his boots, left neatly in the center of the woods, a few feet from the edge of the clearing. And there, beneath the leaves, was a fresh grave. The ground had been disturbed as if something, or someone, had been buried in a hurry. But no body was ever found. And so the whispers continued, growing louder with each passing year. Sammy's disappearance, his return, and the strange events that followed were a mystery that would never be solved. The town of Ashwood remained, but it was no longer the peaceful haven it once was. Some say that if you stand in the woods long enough, you'll hear Sammy's voice, whispering your name, calling you to the clearing. And if you listen closely, you might just find the grave.